Okay. Well, good evening, everyone. Sure that a couple more people will come into the room. Uh, so I want us to get started because I'm pretty tired, and I don't know if I'll be able to sustain all the way till 9. So would definitely uh would like to get going. Um, I want to start by just reminding us of the sort of broader purpose of this program. So this is the second session of a pilot program that's 6 sessions long called the American Spricture Project. And the American Spricture Project is an idea which is designed to is an exploration of great texts of the American canon, and to look at those texts through a Jewish lens with the goal of sort of breaking open our assumptions about them and using them to help us to think about democracy and Jewish spirituality in a new, different way. So I think I really deeply connect to this idea that one of the reasons why Jews have felt so differently comfortable in this place, in the United States of America, is the vision that our founders had for these sort of core values of American democracy. And yet, how they understood that vision, sort of to borrow the sort of terminology of originalism, right? How the founders understood those visions may be different from how we do. And also, there has been some success and some less than success living up to that ideal. And yet, this has been a place where it's been over history relatively very safe to be Jewish, and not just safe, but that our Jewish values are in fact embedded deeply and reflected in the values of the country. And I think it's very powerful for us to look at great texts of our nation with the idea of relating to them through a Jewish lens. So in today's session, in our first session a month ago, we looked at the poem, The Great Colossus, by
Emma Lazarus.
By Emma Lazarus, and we complicated that poem by talking about the new Colossus. We talked about the ways in which Lazarus's poem kind of created an ethos of welcoming to immigrants, and also how it reflected an ethos of being welcoming to immigrants. And we talked about the ways in which the United States has held up to that vision and the ways in which it has not. And we talked about our own experience of being immigrants or children of immigrants, and what that means for us in our Jewish context. And of course, Emma Lazarus was Jewish, so we had this great opportunity to look at a text which was deeply informed by by Jewish values and Jewish tradition. Tonight, we're going to be looking at the Declaration of Independence, which is actually well earlier than the New Colossus. And we're going to continue our exploration into the way we tell the American story, that is the narratives that shape our country. We're going to compare the aspirations of our founders with our current experience and our own knowledge of the past. Did we live up to the standard? We're going to complicate or find flaws in our beloved narratives, and we're going to have to feel the tension about encountering that. And hopefully we're going to be able to think about how Jewish spirituality relates to the values that are contained in the Declaration of Independence and in the ideas that are contained within it. So that's my hope for tonight. And I also want to mention that our educational theme for the year for adult education is the people of the books, and we're looking at that theme in many different ways. For example, at the Burke lectures were about great books that changed the world, and that was one way to think about this idea of people of the books. And we are bringing in a scholar in residence in February from the Jewish Theological Seminary, Dr. Ben Summers, who's going to teach us about the book of books, the Torah. And so that's one way we're going to look at being people of the books. We noticed that there's a real danger of books being banned and books being taken away from the canon, and censorship. And this project, the American Spricture Project, is also in response to that, to the ways in which democracy can get so divisive that people are not willing to speak to each other, not able to see each other, not able to communicate. And so we're doing this course is also responding to that. So we're going to begin with a prayer for the study of Torah, which because what we're doing is studying Torah, studying these American texts as Torah, as sacred Jewish texts. So I invite you to join with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asuk b'divrei Torah. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of all, who hallows us with mitzvot, commanding us to engage with words of Torah. So we're going to start by reading the preamble to the Declaration of Independence. I'm going to read it out loud, and then we're going to pause, and we're all going to have an opportunity to write either in the chat or longhand if you prefer to take notes or whatever. If you do want to write in the chat, I just ask that you don't press enter until I say, okay, we're ready to share, so that everybody has the same amount of time to do the writing without getting distracted by other people's comments. So here's the preamble. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. I'll read it again. It might be familiar to many of us. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So here's the question that I'd like you to think about and write about, either in the chat or on a piece of paper. The question is, what meaning does this text have for your American identity? And what emotions do you feel when listening to this text be read aloud? So the two questions. The first is, what meaning does this text have to your American identity? Like, what is the relationship between this text, the Declaration of Independence, and your American identity? And the second question is, what emotions do you feel when listening to this text be read? And while you're writing, I'll just read it one more time. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. All right. Maybe take another minute to continue responding to the prompt. All right. If you did write in the chat, I encourage you to now press enter. And also, if you didn't write in the chat, but would like to share, the question is, how does hearing the preamble to the Declaration of Independence make you feel? How does it make you feel? And what meaning does this text have in your American identity? How is it connected to your sense of being an American? So if anybody wants to share an answer to one of those questions, you feel free to put it in the chat or to raise your hand and share. Sonia, you have to unmute.
Yeah, I wrote, I feel sad because it feels like our government is failing in this day and age. And is that because these words are lacking something? Maybe they appeal too much to self-interest.
All right. Thank you for sharing, Sonia. Can you say a little bit more about self-interest? What do you mean?
Like when, for instance, the Ten Commandments are the basis of the Jewish religion, and you consider, I don't know, happiness seems kind of trite compared when you compare it to the Ten Commandments. I think it was, if it just said life and liberty, I don't know why, but the pursuit of happiness is really bothering me because I think people get very carried away with that particular ideal in our country. And it's their selfish pursuit of happiness.
Nice. All right. Thank you for sharing, Sonia. Martha.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that, came to mind, I mean, is the statement seems, it's kind of a great focus on seems very powerful, sort of cohesive sensibility. It makes me also wonder, when this was written, what meaning did it have? What was the social context of then versus now? And I get on my treadmill and I watch walking tours of old Boston and this and that, and I find myself sometimes just wishing that God would send like Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and a few of those guys back. Really, like how it's like, part of me said, how I feel a little scary that they actually put in there that we could kind of like willy-nilly, hey, if it's not working for you, let's change it up. And I'm like, I don't think so. I'm like, not really. Let's really not do that. And I also really like what Sonia was pointing out about how our culture, I often pray that the people in government would have less focus on personal power and acquisition and more focus on the common good. It's like, God, please let us just start thinking about the common good. And that is what it reminded me of when Sonia was sharing. Yeah.
Thank you. Steve, I see you have your hand up. Just going to ask, we will have plenty of time to respond directly to what other folks have said, but I'd like us to start by just sharing, what meaning does this text have in your American identity, and what emotions do you feel when listening to the text? And we're going to get in, we can provide some some greater context and some sense of its original intent and all of that. But when you stuck your hand up, I just wanted to, anyway,
you read correctly.
Yeah.
I will reserve some comments for when you move to that phase.
Yeah.
The two things I was going to quickly say were that are not responsive to other comments was that always a little bit mindful that the people who wrote this document owned slaves. So they clearly had some limited scope of understanding what it meant that we probably should be broadening. And the other one, as far as American identity, this is partly a function of what I teach at the college, but there are very deep roots of this document in both England and Switzerland. And so this document to me is less American than you might think, because the amount of content here that's actually American is really not very great. An enormous amount of this comes out of Rousseau. And that's where I'll stop, because that will also be a lot of my response to what other people are saying.
Yeah. I mean, right. When I took a class about Locke, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau in college, the ways in which the phrases that Jefferson uses in this text do have actual like philosophical roots, mostly in the writings of Locke, but Hobbes and Rousseau very much also informed it. And so yeah, no question that there's a lot of history to these exact phrases, and he picked them very carefully. And so I think that's absolutely right.
And modified them very carefully, but
that's modified them, right? Well, yes, you have to take, like a rabbi who might misquote deliberately a verse from the Torah in order to make a point. Yeah. Nice. So I think your point about the Jefferson's personal history of being a slave owner in the context of all men are created equal and have unalienable rights definitely forces us to struggle a bit with what those words meant and continue to mean in our American context. Very, very important point. Does anyone else want to share what they feel when they read this? Yes, Edith.
I'm going to come at this from a different perspective entirely. For a couple of years, I would attend the 4th of July celebration at the battlefield up in Saratoga. And that always had part of it was that new citizens would be sworn in at that point. The other was a complete reading of the Declaration of Independence, where I realized for the first time how much of it was spent in spelling out what the British had done to the people of the colonies that really got the people in the colonies all upset. And that, so when you're reading that last part about changing government, the whole thing was set up to set out the reasons why these colonies should become free and change their government. So, but yet, and I've got to say that all men are created equal, and can we, kind of emphasize the men part of it? Women had no rights anyway. But I know, as I said, what I can think back to is those afternoons out on the porch at the battlefield and listening to the Declaration of Independence being read
and to new citizens of the United States, and what this whole thing really meant.
Right. I think your point that reading only the preamble gives us kind of a skewed picture of what this document is, because the heart of the document, which is the Bill of Particulars, that is a legal case that King George III has overstepped his role in governing the colonies. And right, and we all remember taxation without representation is tyranny, and the Boston Tea Party and all of that. Like, this document comes in a long history, as Steve began to point to, of European conversations and discussion of the legal authority and right of kings to rule. And ultimately, right, this is less of a break with that as much as a continuation of that conversation. And it led to a pretty brutal, bloody war that the colonies could very easily have lost. And would have probably without the without the French help. Other thoughts?
Well, another thing that kind of makes me sad about this is that it puts so much faith in the judgment of the people. And looking at our world today and our country today, are we worthy of that? Are we worthy of? I remember Dr. Burke saying, maybe democracy isn't the solution, isn't going to work. He said in his last series of, he threw out that question in his last series of lectures. Are we able to, in good faith, run a democracy? Or is our judgment that good?
Well, Jefferson and his contemporaries also struggled with that question, and they didn't think that it should be everyone, just white male landowners to start out with, and then maybe white male everybody. But not everybody. We wouldn't trust just anybody to vote. So yeah, I mean, I think you're right? Like, we've learned to read this text more expansively, for good and for complicated, for good, like, I'm for an expansive reading of it. And then you really have a challenge of sort of what it means to have that kind of open to everybody to pick a course of government. Yeah, no question. No question. Of course, here in this country, we only have 18 or 19 or 20% participation in voting. Maybe, if that, different counties, different statistics. I think it's probably a little higher here in Niskayuna than the average. But still, like, even if we got to 50% participation, which would be way higher than the average participation in voting, that's still only half of the people eligible. Yeah. Andy.
I guess I'm going to take a more positive approach. When I read this, it sends chills up my spine, that we have these rights, that we have these freedoms, that the dangers these people were taking in writing this document. It's just, to me, it's a phenomenal document. Is it perfect? No, especially 200 and whatever years later. No, but it's still just a phenomenal document, and I love reading it and I love hearing it. So
Yeah. I think the phrase endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that is such a beautiful turn of phrase. There's something soaring about that. Something deeply spiritual. So I completely hear that, Andy. Like when I read this, I also am like, wow.
well, to me, the power is in the people, not in the government. You know, just this whole concept is just phenomenal.
Yeah.
I want to start waving the flag and start marching. You know, it's great.
Yeah. Here we have the right to choose our government.
Yeah.
And we're going to choose government for the people, by the people, of the people. Yeah, to borrow a phrase from Abraham Lincoln. Yeah. One thing that popped into my head when Sonia was first started our conversation is to think about what it means to think of rights versus obligations. Sonia pointed to sort of this right to pursue happiness, right to life, liberty, and pursue happiness. And Sonia was talking about how the pursuit of happiness feels like maybe it's too self-centered, and maybe has too much of a focus on the individual and not enough of a focus on the community. And I do wonder if that aspect is consistent with our Jewish values. I tend to feel that Judaism speaks more about obligations than about rights. And what does it look like if you think about something in the language of obligation? Now, obviously, right, their obligation was to the crown. And so they couldn't base their idea on a sense of traditional obligations, because they were trying to separate from those in some sense. I hear that too. All right. So we're going to move forward. You can follow along with me if you'd like in the the workbook I sent, and I'll also share the screen. We're going to read through some more of this text with looking at sort of three themes. We're going to look at the theme of incomplete equality. That's which came up in our opening conversation. Sort of, what does it mean that we say all men are created equal, but not women, but not Black men, but not savages, right? The native peoples, indigenous folks, which are referred to in this document as savages. So we'll talk about that. That's sort of the incomplete equality question. We're going to look at the role of God, endowed by their creator. What does that mean exactly? And what is the role of God and religion in this country? And we're going to look at the right to protest. So we'd like to look through this text with all of with those deep explorations, and I'm going to try to do to do this, where I split us out into breakout groups to discuss but maybe we'll just stay together. So the first theme that we're going to look at is the theme of incomplete equality. I'm going to share the screen. Okay. A reminder that we seek first to understand, not to be understood. We disagree without being disagreeable, and everyone participates. We tackle problems, not people. Just some guidelines for group dialogue. All right, so here we are. The first theme, incomplete equality. Thomas Jefferson sought to infuse the Declaration of Independence with a deep dependence on the concept of equality. Although he does not use this language, Jefferson recognizes that we are B'Tselem Elohim, created in the image of God, imbued with certain unalienable rights. This narrative, while deeply Jewish and American, is not without its challenges. Only a few lines down in the Declaration, Jefferson denigrates Native Americans. The narrative of equality is central to the American identity, even as inequality has always played an enormous role in our national conversations. When we Americans confront this paradox, we are left with a choice: assert the truth of equality in America and deny objective reality, or turn the equality narrative into a national aspiration, making the future ever present and America just over the horizon. Sonia, how does that sort of choice, the choice between saying, yep, everybody's equal here, we have complete equality, even though that might not be objectively true, or to say, well, we aspire to equality, and we're always striving for a more perfect union, and America just over the horizon? What do you think?
I think that we still have a problem with incomplete equality. And maybe it's an ego problem that some people have to think that they're better than other people. And that's why in the latest conflict with Israel and Gaza, people didn't have sympathy. A lot of people did not have sympathy for the Jewish people, and they did have sympathy for the Muslim people. Should I go into more detail, or is that kind of apparent what I'm trying to say? For instance, when Jewish people were murdered, well, they had it coming to them. That's okay. And when Muslim people were killed during the war in Gaza, that was not okay. So that's unequal. It seems like you can put people like our founding fathers and they say, oh, everyone should be equal, but then we can find the hypocrisy that they didn't live up to it. But look at us, look at not me and you, but look at our world today. And there still is a big problem of inequality in people's minds. They say they're equal, but then there's always one group that's not equal to everyone else.
Yeah.
I'm not in a very good mood today. Sorry, I'm taking the pessimistic viewpoint here.
I think it's good to be aware of what emotions you're bringing to the class. Absolutely. All right. So let's look at some of the text of the Declaration. We looked at the preamble. This is farther down. Would somebody like to read the text?
Sure.
All right.
He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriation of lands.
All right. So this is a complaint that Jefferson has against the king, against King George III. Note the centrality of land acquisition and settlement. How important to America is the extent of the land? How important to Jews is land ownership in America? And maybe crucially, how do we reconcile this anger at King George for preventing the colonies from expanding their territory? How do we reconcile that with the reality that these territories were taken from indigenous peoples who lived here?
Apparently, the other doesn't count. In other words, if you're not free white male and 21, you were the other.
Yeah.
And certainly the expropriation of land from the indigenous people was I guess they were just in the way.
So let's see, if you could just clarify for me a little bit of what the process is at this point. So, yeah, are we doing questions? Are we doing the same process we did on the first part? Or is this just general discussion?
Well, I thought we would we would discuss sort of these issues of incomplete equality using the reflection questions. But any, I think, yeah, similar to what we just did, except using these questions to talk about this text.
So I guess the first thing that I think of is just how different, I mean, the colonies were very upset about the treatment by the British king. And yet our consciousness was just not there that the people with, different ethnic appearance from Europeans weren't really accorded the same understanding of, oh, you are here and you have the land, you inhabit the land, this is somehow your land, and just wasn't even in their consciousness that could be the case. Anyway, that's.
Yeah, thank you. All right, let's move on to the next.
I understand the difficulty with this with indigenous peoples, but at the same time, let's just hypothetically assume that we land on some planet, right? And there's some indigenous species there that is not as advanced as us, and we would be easily able to, I'll say, conquer them. What would we do if you landed on a planet with that? Would you leave? Would you, how would you handle that? And that's what occurred here, is that these people basically landed on another planet.
Hmm.
Right? I mean, they and they met people that acted, looked, spoke differently, ate differently, clothed differently, had different relationship with the land and ownership. So how would you do that if you landed on another planet? What would you set up a base, even if it takes land from those indigenous people, those indigenous beings that were there?
Mm-hmm. Does anyone have a response to Andy's question? Yeah, Mark.
Yeah, you could always buy their land rather than appropriating it. It reminds me of what's going on in the West Bank with the settlements, and I find it very disturbing that that these people are just appropriating somebody else's land without payment, without any thought to their pursuit of happiness. And we pretty much did that to the indigenous people here. Jefferson was one of the worst.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it just makes me think about how, when you say paid them for it, and the appearance, the early colonists, whoever, expansionists, attempted to create the appearance of payment, the appearance of agreements and arrangements. And then what I hear from people in that field is, say, simply one after another, with a few maybe noteworthy exceptions, disregarded the agreements that they had made, because you don't look like me, you don't like all the things you listed, your culture is so different, therefore I do not have to respect and honor the agreement that I am telling you I'm actually entering into with you. And so I hear that as a big part of the Native American or Indian story.
So here's another passage from the Declaration of Independence. He has excited domestic insurrections amongst us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is an undistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions.
One like us.
Were you aware of this phrase in the Declaration? How do you feel about its inclusion in the document? And we know that America is not equal. We have to manage the tension between our ideas of equality and how it appears in reality. What would an equal America look like to you?
This is a little off the questions, but this is a case where Jefferson's euphemistic language is burying something. When he says domestic insurrections, he means slave revolts. So his argument is not just that the kings were dealing with the savages, but it was also that he was trying to encourage the slaves to rebel, which is, again, you've got a document of trying to establish equality, but your complaint is that somebody is trying to get your slaves freed. And
yeah, I
not
also
a case of
noticed that.
mismatch of what Jefferson, although Jefferson was aware of the mismatch, let's just say that in his defense.
He was. He was. Yeah, I think one thing that's interesting to me is what makes the Indian, right? What makes them savages in Jefferson's telling is that they do not they don't just kill the men of military age. They kill all people of all ages. Right? That's Jefferson's claim. I think it's just an interesting, like, well, let's read the next paragraph because I think, like, how he refers to the British, who with whom he shares some values and a sense of perhaps some sense of the rule of war, right? Nor have we been wanting in attentions to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They, too, have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind, enemies in war, in peace friends. What does, you know, what do you notice about the contrast between how Jefferson refers to the British and how he referred to the indigenous people? And what does it mean about American ideas of fellowship and willingness to use violence? And also back to this question, like what would an equal America look like to you?
Well, I think what is in common between his description of the Americans to the British and the Americans to Native Americans is that we conceive of ourselves as the victims in both cases. But in the case with the British, it seems a little bit more civilized, like they're not killing, the way he's explaining it, they're not killing children, torturing, whatever. They're just kind of ignoring our rights. So he's giving them more credit. And therefore he feels, there's more equality there because of the way he sees the whole pattern of how he's being mistreated by the British and how he's being mistreated by the Indians.
The language that stands out to me in these contexts is racial ethnic. I don't know how many times I'm, consanguinity and our kindred, common kindred. It's all about we are alike on a racial, ethnic, historical, cultural basis.
Mm-hmm.
And to this day, I have to say, boy, is this familiar. If you, look like me, I may treat you very differently than if you do not. And to this day, I'm like thinking about the guy Chauvin who got stabbed in prison. And I'm like, I was driving around listening, I thought, I'm amazed he hasn't just been outright killed because he was probably the first time a white man got thrown in jail for killing a black. I don't know. That's what it kind of seems like. Anyway, there you go.
Well, I think there's a difference between mistreating someone and torturing someone. And I see a similarity between this comparison here and the son of the Hamas leader who turned against the Palestinians and is now living and hiding in America. He's living in what do they call that, where the government protects them, their identity. And I heard his interview, this, I can't think of his name, the son of the Hamas leader. Why did he turn against the Palestinians, and why did he help the Israelis? And he said that because the Palestinians were torture each other, that when he was in prison in Israel, and he was in prison in Palestine. In Israel, he was never tortured, nor did he see any of his compatriots tortured. But when he was in prison in Palestine, he saw a lot of people tortured, and for very little reason. And he describes their torture, and this is on the internet if anybody wants to look it up. So I think there is a distinction between, I'm not saying he's right in viewing indigenous people as that they were torturing kids but I think there is a distinction between being mistreated in a civilized manner and actually when it involves torture. It is I don't know if I communicated my thought correctly, but
Yeah, and different breadths of scope, maybe different scopes here. Acknowledging the intensity of the Hamas-Israel situation and kind of compare and contrast the whole colonial and present day and all of that. Yeah.
My read on these texts is fairly similar, I think, to Martha's. My snap answer to the first question is that Jefferson wants something from the British, and he doesn't want anything from the Native Americans. So he's using a very different tone to get what he wants. But related to that, Jefferson knew that there was cultural similarity, that he held some cultural values in common with the British that he knew he didn't hold in contact with the Native Americans. And he also knew that there was a substantial minority in Britain, even in Parliament, that favored giving Americans independence. And so he knew he had somebody he could appeal to there. And with the Native Americans, that was not the case.
Yeah. All right, let's look at the role of God in this text. We often see the Declaration as a product of the Enlightenment and view it as the basis for secular human rights. Yet, its logic depends on references to divinity and other religious concepts. This provides a way for a synagogue community to explore the complicated overlap between religion and politics in the American story. While American culture long favored white Anglo-Saxon Protestant Christianity, Americans, especially minority religious groups like Jews and Latter-day Saints, have long treasured the wall of separation between church and state. Any conversation about the role of religion in our American identity must explore how we navigate a deeply theological assertion of American equality and the right to revolt, while also creating a governmental system neutral to religion. The religion narrative is especially relevant within the concept of Torah study in a synagogue. As moderns, we value so much about secularism, our individuality, rationalism, the scientific method, and so forth, while we also hold certain ideas as sacred. The Declaration of Independence itself is considered a sacred American document, a piece of scripture. Why do we need the sacred? Rationally speaking, the Declaration is nothing more than a letter to the king announcing a war, yet it offers something deep for our souls. The counter-narrative here asks us to articulate the role of spiritual and theological beliefs in our secular, rational lives and society. So here are some more texts, quotes from the text, and sort of thinking about the role of God in this. right? The separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Note that the entire American idea rests on a spiritual foundation. There is this mysterious source of human equality being articulated right at the beginning. Jefferson cites divine authority multiple times in the text. How comfortable are we with rooting America's reason for existence in God? Right, here's a couple more. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled, appealing to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are and of right ought to be free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved. Right? Jefferson closes in the same way he begins, by calling on the supreme judge of the world. Are you comfortable with this kind of language?
No.
You want to say more about that, Mark?
It's disturbing in the sense that what's going on today with the evangelicals and the trying to, and certain Congress people trying to establish Christianity as the religion of this country, contrary to what the Declaration states. I think this thing could have been written without the religious note. I think it would be, I don't know what was going on in people's minds at that time, but I think it could have been written without a reference to God. I think it would have been just as effective, maybe not to the king.
Does anyone else have a response to Mark, or to this language of God?
I somewhat agree with Mark, but at the same time, also, it wasn't the king, the religious leader also, and of England, and therefore this is saying, hey, you don't have that role. So it's a direct challenge to the king, isn't it?
I think that's right.
Not even so much the king's role as the head of the church, as the king's claim to rule by divine
By
right.
divine right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm just going back to Mark's question. I am pretty sure that Rousseau writes his parallel argument to this in a way that doesn't invoke divinity at all, or not as explicitly as this, at least. So I think Mark is on the right track here, that this could have been written without that assertion and would be more effective for us today if it had not been. Although I also think Andy is right that it was written this way because it knew what argument it had to meet, which is that God made you English subjects, and that they had to assert that that was not the case, and that trapped them into the religious justification.
Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes I struggle with, like, I definitely want there to be a separation of church and state, because I really deeply believe that the state shouldn't govern religion, especially minority religions, but really all religion, and that no one religion should have any dominance, and we shouldn't be forced to comply with the values of, or the teachings of that one tradition. So I'm very deeply invested in the separation of church and state, but also, like, I used language like the supreme judge of the world all the time. And I think when I act in what I believe is justice in the world, I do so with a deep understanding of that I'm doing so in my relationship with and in service to the divine, as I understand God. And so, right, I don't find this language to be particularly difficult. Like, it's how I would think about it, you know? Like, if I'm trying to say I have a just claim to make this legal argument, I might indeed think of it in just like I might think of justice in religious terms, because I tend to think in religious terms.
That's certainly understandable. And I can understand if you're a theologian and you would think that way, that's fine, as long as you don't impose that on people that have other views. I don't know if I'm making myself clear.
The thing that strikes me is that there's nothing in this use of language which is problematic for Judaism. The word Jesus is conspicuously missing in this document.
Yep.
Now, that's not true if you're an atheist. So there are people, and were people probably even at that time, who have had a problem with it. But Jews don't really have standing to object to this, because everything that's used here, the notion that God is a source of moral authority, is consistent with what we believe. At most, we're uneasy because we know there are other people who might not be able to buy into this language. And the founding fathers knew they had Jews in the country, and Washington had written a letter to the Newport Synagogue, I think, and he was aware that he was trying to state his convictions in a way that was consistent with the way Jews thought about religion. And that's one of the things that makes it easier for us to deal with this language, is that I don't know how deliberately, I don't think they were thinking so much about Jews. I think they're about Jefferson's own deistic theological beliefs. But they were definitely writing this in a broad way intentionally, and that makes it easier for us to approach it today.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Supreme Judge of the world feels very accessible.
I would have to just jump on the bandwagon and say I'm very comfortable with this kind of language.
Yeah. I mean, I also deeply, deeply want like there to not be, for the country to not be overtly imposing Christian ideas on everybody else. Like, and Supreme Judge of the world, that sort of works for me.
I have to say that it's a very interesting observation about the evangelical Christian stuff and some of the things going on here that we don't like. But I periodically say to my mother, evangelical Christians, Israel's new best friend. And in fact, I believe that there's actually a designated government area just to deal with the rapport between evangelical Christianity and Israel.
Yeah, well, that's complicated too.
I think they have a prior motive. They can't have rapture without Israel.
And certainly that is one aspect of their teaching. All right, let's do this third theme, the right to protest. The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the power and to assume among the powers of the earth. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles, and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. So some questions are, this is a declaration of war. What makes this document legitimate? Why are some revolutions legitimate and others not? What does a destructive government mean to you? Who decides when a government has become destructive? Who holds a destructive government accountable? We have an American narrative today of constitutionalism, the idea of a difficult to change document that establishes a framework for our government. Pre-Constitution, the narrative was that people can base the right to govern on whatever they choose to base it on. Jefferson himself envisioned a constitution with a 19-year expiration date. What are the pros and the cons of this system? The tyrant or the despot plays a special role in the American imagination. How does a tyrant differ from a strong executive leader? Note that at various moments in American history, people have agitated for a dictatorial leader. Why?
Indeed.
Yeah, I mean, a dictator would solve the problem of gridlock in Congress, right?
Yeah.
That's how, right, Caesar took power in the Senate in ancient Greece, right? In ancient Rome, right? The Senate voted to give up their own legislative authority in favor of sort of enlightened dictatorial rule.
I guess that's okay if you have an enlightened dictator, but there aren't too many of those around.
I think I do a pretty good job. Just kidding.
Well, then again, we have Trump right around the corner.
That's scary.
Yeah. Why are some revolutions legitimate and some are not?
Because the story is told by the victor.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was my immediate response too, right? Like what makes it a revolution versus a rebellion is who wins.
You know, in reading this thing, and if you didn't know what happened, you said, gee, couldn't they have handled this diplomatically? Why did they have to go to war? Let's just have a nice separation and work things out. Unfortunately, it didn't happen that way. But you wonder when reading this if they could have done that way without a war.
Well, when Canada separated from England in what, 72? When did Canada separate? It was without a war.
Yeah. Did we really need a war, or was it King George's fault?
Well, we know Jefferson went to England and considered himself, he was looking to be treated with honor and dignity as a subject of the British throne. And they said that when he realized that they really did not hold him in the same respect as they did the other British lords and whatever, he then got it. It was a turning point for him, and he went back and realized that he could not remain loyal to the crown, and he turned his whole effort toward the colonies and an insurrection.
sorry, it was 82, not 72, when Canada became independent of the Commonwealth. Well, there was a lot to think about in tonight's exploration of the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence is an aspirational document that founds the country on a set of moral ideals rather than a specific ethnicity, religion, or geography. It's powerful. Jefferson, Madison, and other American founders relied on the economics of slavery, but they knew it was evil. They did their best to keep it out of sight, and they assumed that it would disappear over time. We still feel a tension between the Declaration's aspiration and America's willingness to tolerate or rationalize inequality. The foundational aspiration that all men are created equal did not initially include all people. Yet over time, it has been the fulcrum upon which minority groups in America, including Jews, have leveraged progressive change in law and society. The bill of particular grievances the colonists held against the British Crown justified revolution because they were insults against the unalienable rights articulated in the preamble. The narratives of the Declaration rest upon a belief in rights that derive from a divine power, without specifying any specific dogma or doctrine to describe that divinity. Paradoxically, America's moral foundation depends on both the power of faith and the freedom of each person to define that faith. The Torah's opening description of humanity created in the divine image is the foundation for Judaism's support for universal principles of liberalism. So we're gonna close. I'll send out an email with the recording of this class in case you want to go back and think about it some more. And also with the workbook for next session. The next session we're going to look at will be titled "What to the Slave is the 4th of July?" And it's a speech by Frederick Douglass. What to the Slave is the 4th of July, which we started talking about a little bit in our last session, and which we're going to really dive deeply into. And that will be in 3 weeks' time on Thursday, the 21st of December. And I look forward to engaging with you then.
Rabbi, where can we get the worksheet? We never got one.
I sent it to you this morning, so I definitely included you in the email.
Okay, it's on an email.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Yep.
I thought the workbook, Rabbi, was in the first email, the email for the first class. I didn't see it in.
You didn't get it this morning?
Today. I didn't get an email from you. I got just the Zoom link
Right.
from the organization.
I did send one, and I know I re-entered all of the email addresses, so I know that I added you.
I did receive it.
Yeah. Andy, it's possible that I sent it to the wrong email of yours. Happy to check that out and see. I'll do the best I can in getting. I sent it to agavins@nycap.rr.com.
I'm not sure we got it either.
All right. Well, I'll do my best to try to get it to you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all